I'll make a start. It's my great pleasure to welcome you. My name is Tony Solomon to the first of our Inclusivity Works lunch and learn sessions. Now today the spotlight is very much on deafness in the workplace. Something like 1 in 6 people in the UK are either deaf or hard of hearing. When I found out that statistic, I thought, wow, that's way beyond what I perhaps thought. Over 150,000 people in the UK. Can I start my video? I'm still unable to start mine, but it's good to see Reg and Laura. Over 150,000 people are British Sign Language users. Now, I work with the GEM project, which is an employability project in Gloucestershire that's funded by the National Lottery Community Fund and the European Social Fund. And our aim is to work alongside people in Gloucestershire who are facing real barriers to getting into work. Now, over the last 5 years, we've supported over 2,000 people in Gloucestershire. And I'm delighted, I'm here, good afternoon. And I'm delighted to say that many of those people are in work or in further education and training. So 5 years we've been doing this. And as a result of this work has been the development of a brand new, fresh initiative called Inclusivity Works. Inclusivity Works is all about raising awareness and providing support for employers to recognise and to realise the massive business benefits there are in making your business diverse and by having an inclusive culture in the workplace. Now, today I have the pleasure of talking with Reg Cobb, who is the Senior Operations Manager at the Gloucestershire Deaf Association. Now, GDA are a partner of GEM, so I know Reg pretty well. We've worked together quite closely over the last 5 years, and it's my great pleasure to introduce him in a moment. But in terms of housekeeping, could you please put your questions in the chat box, and we will come to those after we've had the discussion with Reg. So anything you want to know, just pop it into the chat box. We'll be talking for around 20-25 minutes, and then there'll be questions afterwards. So, okay, so firstly, let me start by saying hello, Reg, and welcome.
Hi there, hello.
To Laura as well, who's Reg's interpreter. And I'm going to start, Reg, really with the first question for you, if I may, which is to ask you to begin by telling us something of your own personal story.
Yeah, well, if you've got about 3 hours, I could start from the very beginning, but if we don't have that, no problem at all. So I'm Reg, I grew up deaf, I was born deaf, and both my parents were deaf as well. I went to school with other deaf children, which actually meant that my life story has a very strong deaf cultural root. And actually only 10% of people who are born deaf have deaf parents. So actually many deaf people consider me as lucky to have deaf parents, because I always had that ability to communicate with them about my feelings, about humour, and have in-depth conversations with them. So I had a real privilege growing up because my parents were deaf. Now I am married and my wife is deaf. She's quite famous. She's a presenter on the BBC for a deaf programme. And we both have 3 children who are grown up now. But all of our children are hearing. So there are some challenges with that, which means at night we have to be quite quiet, not to disturb the children. We have to tiptoe across without being thoughtful about how much noise we're making. And actually my wife, her parents are deaf as well. So that's our background.
Excellent. So Reg, what have been the major challenges you faced, and what are the common misconceptions about deaf people?
Really, it's that lack of communication and that struggle with kind of hearing awareness. Often hearing people maybe don't understand some of the issues or the impacts or the consequences of deafness. Many people perhaps assume that along with a communication barrier means there must also be a cognitive impairment there. Actually, that's not the case. I remember when I was at my first year of college, and I was the only deaf student and all of my other peers were hearing. I was on a course studying architecture at the time, and many of them looked down on me. I just accepted it and continued on. One day there was a maths test. The results came out, and many people were kind of getting 20%, maybe 25%, quite low marks. And at the end was my name. It said, Reg Cobb had 100% on this test. And suddenly the attitude of my peers changed because they all thought that I had a cognitive impairment because I didn't speak English. I just had a communication difference and they misunderstood who I was. But actually, there are many deaf people who are very knowledgeable.
Okay, but do you think, Reg, since your time, if you like, that things have greatly improved? Because after all, there is generally, I think, across the employment landscape, a greater awareness of disability?
Yeah, I think the easy answer, we can see the example from Rose, who's the contestant on Strictly Come Dancing at the moment. She is such a brilliant representative of the deaf community, demonstrating what deaf people can do. And interestingly enough, her dance, if you saw it last week, there was part of it where they danced in silence, and there was this shock to the audience. And the shock comes from people not being aware of what it's like to be deaf. You know, we can kind of understanding what it might be like for someone to be in a wheelchair, or maybe someone to not be able to see, but the shock of what it's like to live as a deaf person and what that means in reality to be deaf. I think that was so brilliant to portray that. And actually, Rose herself, you know, has had some experiences, and I remember on social media having this exposure through there. And if we were to consider maybe other movements to do with diversity, for example, with race, like the Black Lives Matter movement and other areas of diversity, those are often seen very positive. We see over time how that increase in positivity on those. I feel like that same consideration for deafness and disability isn't quite there yet.
Okay, so still work to do, but as you say, that dance was absolutely incredible and very memorable. I mean, it was just stay in our memories for a long time. So, Reg, what are the...
Yeah, and I could show you some of my dancing, but maybe another time would be better.
I've seen your dad dancing. We don't want to talk about that. So Reg, what are the biggest barriers? You've touched on some of them to deaf people succeeding in the workplace.
The most common barrier we find is usually to do with the excuse regarding health and safety. And of course, health and safety is really important. However, we shouldn't be picking at things unnecessarily. We want to be looking at ourselves and to be genuine, whether it's a genuine health and safety issue or not. Perhaps you might remember a story I told before about a deaf gentleman who wanted to get into some work. He went to a recruitment agency, and someone took him to interview, and so he went to his interview, and most of the interview was to do with health and safety questions right from the outset of that interview, rather than about the job. And they said, please, would you they didn't even look at his CV yet. They just wanted to ask him about his deafness and not whether he was capable. They hadn't even read. As actually, he'd been working in a kitchen before. It was a kitchen related job, and he had the experience. And then after that, it then took them 3 months for that recruitment agency to investigate how the deaf gentleman could get into work. At the end, I was a little bit naughty. I bypassed to the employer and said to him, the employers, would it be possible to give him a work trial for a day to see if he could do the job? They agreed. He went to the work trial and passed, and then got the job in 1 day's work. The recruitment agency spent so much time dilly-dallying, and sometimes it just takes that out of the box thinking to get these opportunities.
Yeah, out of the box thinking. That's great. And I think also we find work trials generally can be such an effective way of getting the measure of somebody. Interviews tend to have their flaws. So we encourage work trials wherever we can with our participants. But thinking about employers, Reg, what can an employer do to make their recruitment processes, their interview processes more accessible to the deaf community, enabling them to shine, if you like, in their new roles?
Yeah, really interesting question. There was one employer, I think, who had a few deaf people working in their place of work, and they had recruited them, and lots of them were from a local deaf organisation. And, you know, they contacted the local deaf organisation, who often knows those people, and they picked 3 staff, and then the 4th one, they didn't. And they used some for that one, the interview was a very structured question and answer, but didn't take that kind of real performance of the person. You know, they didn't take into account, you know, the language barrier and the anxiety, and it didn't work in their favour. And so often having that, as I mentioned before, with that deaf gentleman, actually, think about those positives. Deaf people have incredibly sharp focus and vision. Deaf people often have can see on a wider scale compared to hearing, because they're reliant on that. And deaf people are often excellent communicators because they pick up body language cues maybe better than their hearing peers, which means in the workplace they will perform really well, rather than just being in this kind of interview process where you ask them direct questions. It's really worth giving them an opportunity to shine.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And can you give us some examples, Reg, of people that have shone, that you've worked with, that you've perhaps through the GEM project that you've worked with and you've got into jobs, and talk to us about some of the successes that you've had and the benefits they've brought to their employers?
Yeah, of course. Really, well, it's thanks to the things like the GEM project, because they've given me the time to be working with deaf people. There was one day I was with somebody, and we went for a coffee just to sit down and have a chat, because the job centre said that they've got different kind of jobs in retail, but the participant wasn't really interested. And so I said to them, you know, what's their kind of real area of interest? And he said photography. Because he'd been to college, he got a qualification in photography. And so I said, okay, what's your favourite thing to photograph? He loved taking pictures of cars. So opposite where we were sat having a coffee was a Jaguar Land Rover car showroom. You know, they're linked to Land Rover. And so I just said, well, let's go and ask them whether or not he could do some. Land Rover said to me that the salesman usually takes photos of their cars, but often the quality of the photos aren't that brilliant. And so I said, well, this deaf gentleman is excellent at taking photos. Would it be possible for him to come in on a voluntary basis and he could take some photos of the cars for you? So they accepted him for a work trial just for a few months. After a few months, Land Rover, their used car sales really skyrocketed because of the quality of the photos. They said that customers had flown it down from Scotland in order to look, because they had seen the high quality of the car through the photos. But in the end, Land Rover gave him the job because of that, because of the skills that he demonstrated on a voluntary basis that helped the employer to increase their car sales.
So, I mean, that's a real benefit, increasing profitability and increasing overall business. And that's just one example there, Reg. And I know, having worked with you, there are many, many others. And that's great. So what about the qualities and strengths? You've again touched on that, but let's just focus on that. Somebody who's deaf, profoundly deaf, what qualities and strengths may they have that perhaps hearing people don't?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a term that we call deaf gain. There's a hashtag that we often use with it out there, so you can look up hashtag deaf gain. there actually is a thing of people benefiting from those from the deaf community. For example, things like in communication. I could tell you that people often are on art-based courses. You might notice there are many in that area because deaf people are so visual. They use their eyes to pick up so much information, which means that so much of that translates across to quite creative thinking. Often they're excellent at communicating, as I mentioned. There's been some research, you know, if you were to go online, you could have a look on Google to type in 7 through 38, 55. You will find a concept for hearing communication that only 7% of our communication is based on our words. 38% is on the tone of voice, and 55% of our communication comes from body language, which means that we have to think that actually deaf people can be experts in communication. Often we think, oh yeah, deaf people, it's so difficult to communicate, but actually there's so much that they may pick up that someone else may not. And going back to that point about creative thinkers, good communicators, those sharp eyes, I would say those are the 3 top things that I would say. And also often really hard working, because you know, in an office environment, people might be chatting to each other across the room. Deaf people won't be interacting as part of that. Just get on with it, focus and get on with their work.
Excellent. Excellent. And I suppose, Reg, it's a big question, but what types of roles, based on what you've just said, what types of roles are very popular within the deaf community? What do they gravitate towards? I'm being far too generalist, but perhaps you can help us with that.
No, I understand. Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned before about this kind of concept of cognitive impairment, often people think, oh, a deaf person, there's no way they could be a doctor or get a, you know, a highly skilled job. But actually, it's purely to do with communication and that physical deafness. Often that means they can't answer the phone, which is fine, because if you provide an interpreter in that environment, they can use the phone. Across the UK, there are so many, I don't know, film directors or doctors and nurses. There are so many out there, you know, and the world is, you know, waiting for deaf people, and we're waiting for society to really bring them to the forefront. And I feel a bit like I've got into my Martin Luther King speech mode. So yeah, before I say too much more, I'll stop.
You're a great ambassador, Reg, and we all love you for that. Just coming back though to health and safety, because as an employer, I mean, when you were mentioning somebody working in a kitchen, you know, it went through my mind, knives, etc. What about the health and safety aspects? How do employers deal with that?
Yeah, I would prefer if organisations are unsure, but the first step is ask the deaf person, you know, what are you doing? What can we do? Is there any feedback? Let's have a conversation about it where we can both feedback about reality and then come to conclusions on that. And if there are some times where it might be difficult, you might want to contact your local deaf organisation for support, and maybe they would have some extra ideas. So the GEM project, for example, they asked us here at GDA to be able to support in order for deaf people to get into work.
Right, right, excellent. So in terms of support, what support is available to an employer to make sure that deaf person can get into the role and do it to the best of their ability and to be of real service to the company?
Well, so I receive funding from the government. It's called Access to Work, which means that I get funding which enables me to book interpreters. Like you can see Laura on the screen, she's a fully qualified sign language interpreter who is booked to work with me, which enables me to have this interview so that I can communicate with you, Tony. So it's a privilege to be able to have a conversation, but without the interpreter, it'll be significantly harder. So through that Access to Work funding, we can do this. So Access to Work, you can apply for the interview process. It's a very quick process, that one. So you can apply online on their website. You You have to ask for an agency, you know, someone like GDA, for a quote. So you can put that in, and then Access to Work will approve that, provide the sign language interpreter or whoever for the interview. Then there's a more in-depth question. I would really recommend asking an organisation like us, because then they have an application form to apply for funding. And there are 4 elements that you usually find here at GDA that we'll be applying for. The first of those is for British Sign Language interpreters like Laura, to help with that communication element. Secondly, we would have job coaching. You know, sometimes deaf people may not understand the social or professional boundaries in the workplace in the same way, you know, how to follow policies and procedures. So sometimes they might benefit from a little bit of extra one-to-one support. You don't want that to be too onerous on the employer, and so deaf mentors can come in to assist with that. Thirdly, we can provide deaf awareness training, which means that it helps the employer understand how to communicate on a superficial level when they're working with their deaf staff. And then also we can provide communication support workers. So communication support workers, you know, sometimes there might be a problem that comes up in the workplace because of a miscommunication. You know, a professional British Sign Language interpreter is very helpful for meetings, for example, to make sure that no information gets missed. But sometimes we have those kind of incidental conversations, or you know, a deaf person might be missing the office gossip or something that's happening in the background. And so a communication support worker is someone who bridges the gap between a deaf person and the team that they're working in to help with that communication on that more superficial level.
So there is really a great deal of help out there, and Access to Work, we've come across it in a number of different areas. We have somebody who is unable to get on a bus, so they're actually paid to go to work in a taxi. So you know, it's there, it's available. We find it, at least I found it when I started this role, as one of the government's best kept secrets, but it's there to support employers and to support the employee, to enable them to be the very best they can. So please use that. And Gloucestershire Deaf Association.
Yes,
sorry,
and it's not a secret anymore. We've just told everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. But you'd be surprised how many people don't know about it. And to find out more, Gloucestershire Deaf Association, their website and the resources that Reg and his team are able to offer. So I've got a final question, Reg, for those employers that are joining us here today. What would be your 3 top tips for an employer that's looking to take on somebody who may be very hard of hearing or profoundly deaf?
I would recommend, my tip number 1 would be ask a deaf organisation for support. I know that there are many around the country. Many national organisations are brilliant at what they do, but sometimes you need that local level organisation because they will have the knowledge of the people in their area, which means their interpreters will often know those people as well, so they can think how best to match someone up with that deaf person. That would be 1. So tip number 1, ask your local deaf organisation for support, because there are many out there. And if you don't know about one in your area, please contact me. I can help to refer you on to that. Secondly, is to look at yourselves as employers. Do an impact assessment. Think about what you can do to improve. You know, you might have heard of purple mouth. So there are many disabled people who have money to spend, and the employers and the customers maybe might marginalise the deaf community, but actually they have some money to pay for services. So, but also we want to be thinking about how we can do an impact assessment, ask local deaf organisations for help to do an impact assessment to find out about that. Thirdly, last one would be, ask me to play golf with you. I'm very happy to have a chat on the golf course. Isn't that right, Tony?
Yeah, you prompt me to tell a short story there, Reg, which Yes, Reg and I played golf, and he was slightly better than he claimed to be, put it that way. I'll say no more, Reg. But it was wonderful, and I haven't played you since for fear of being thrashed again. So 3 really good things
Sorry,
there.
my fault.
And I hope in the half an hour we've spent talking to Reg that people have perhaps a different perspective on deafness and of the benefits that people can bring, who may be hard of hearing, who may be profoundly deaf, but can bring to the business community, and the help that is available out there for employers to really make this work and to help them to become more diverse. So thank you, Reg, and thank you very much indeed, Laura. I'm going to move into questions. I've got 1 or 2, I think, here. One from Chris. Is there any issue with deaf people being isolated in the workplace because there are no other sign language speakers?
Yes, that does happen a lot. And that's why I propose, of the 4 applications you can make to access to work, one of those is a communication support worker. Because, we've got interpreters and communication support workers, both work at different rates, which means sometimes the interpreter have a fee of a certain value, but there might be gaps during the day where they're not being used, which isn't a good use of the interpreter's time. If many people, many deaf people get jobs, then the demand is incredibly high. And so we need to be thinking about some people who have perhaps level 3 sign language. We can assess their capabilities. We don't want people who cowboy interpreters out there, so to speak. Absolutely not. But through us, we can assess someone's sign language level and place the right kind of person to be that go-between, not to go between the deaf person and the hearing staff. Maybe the staff are going to Newcastle for the weekend, and there was a big deaf social, and the hearing people there don't know about that it happened, which means that then you might want to ask, oh, what did you do at the weekend? It kind of facilitates those conversations. And then after that, there's more chance of colleagues becoming friends and reducing that.
Thank you. It's a question from Claire. Work trials, it's a complex area of employment, of employment law. Where is the best guidance on this matter? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if you would, Reg, or we can find out.
Yeah, I think each employer is unique for a start. I know the reason that I mention work trials is because you cannot apply for funding for a voluntary role through Access to Work, which means if a deaf person would be interested in a trial, they can't pay, and for voluntary, they can't pay for interpreters because the criteria is very clear for how you get that funding. For a work trial, on the condition that there is a job at the end, you can get the funding. Right. Which therefore means that often deaf people will lose out on employment. If it's a very systematic approach. That's why we have to think outside the box to create the role, to find out if we can make that work for a trial basis, and then the government will fund to pay the interpreters. It might take 2 or 3 weeks. I've got 2 cases actually that come to mind. One was successful and one wasn't actually, because at the end of the work trial, we realized that actually that deaf person wasn't suitable for the role, which means that a job offer didn't come from it. However, that job then became advertised even more widely due to that process.
Okay, thank you. We will, I think, draw to a close. There's a question here though, Reg, if I may ask, from Corinne. Do you lip read or use a communication device when you're chatting to non-signing people?
So I can lip read. I remember lip reading generally will only enable you to get about 20% of what is being said. Mm. So I can use that to my advantage sometimes. Often people will talk at me and I'll just say, yes, please, milk, no sugar. And really, lip reading is incredibly challenging. Out there, they have some professionals called lip speakers who don't use sign language, but you can book them through Access to Work as well, which means it's someone who's trained to talk very clearly with extra kind of gesture or expression, which helps somebody who is relying on lip reading to understand. Often it's very difficult, particularly in a group context. There are too many people talking over each other. It's difficult to see what's happening. So then they might have just one lip speaker in front of them to point out who is speaking and say what they're saying. So that's also another service that's possible to be got through Access to Work.
Thank you. Final question. Really good. Megan here has started to learn BSL, but wondered if there are any local funds or support networks to offer this training to a team in the workplace.
Well, to learn BSL is one thing, and to learn deaf awareness is another. So you can offer funding for deaf awareness training, which means, you know, for example, we can go to an employer, the employer doesn't have to pay, the government can fund to cover that. But if you want to learn British Sign Language, that's often another story. You can't get funding for that, which means that that is something that the responsibility for funding would be on the employer.
Okay. Well, I'd just like to say thank you to Reg and to Laura. Really appreciate your time today. And thank you all for joining us. In a moment, the session will close and there will be a very short survey afterwards, literally less than 60 seconds. But we'd really appreciate your feedback so that we can make these sessions even better, so that help us to shape those future sessions. You've signed in for a complete series of lunch and learn sessions. So over the next 3 weeks, Tuesday lunchtimes at 12 o'clock, we're going to be looking at neurodiversity in the workplace, recruiting foreign workers and refugees, and we'll be looking at diversity in all of its forms as well. So we do hope that you'll be able to join us for that. Please share this with any colleagues or friends that you have that you think may be interested. You know, together we want to make Gloucestershire a beacon for inclusion in the UK. So not only it's a great place to live and a great place to be, but it's a great place to work, and an inclusive environment where everybody can bring their whole selves to work, regardless of their perspectives and backgrounds. So you can find out more about Inclusivity Works on our website, www.inclusivityworks.org, and that will come up in a moment. We have a LinkedIn page, which we'd love you to join, or by contacting me, Tony Solomon, or my colleague, Sue Gilding, and we'll be only too happy to help and to talk to you about something that's been launched as part of the programme, which is the Gloucestershire Inclusive Employer Award. It's a very special award. It's purely for employers in Gloucestershire, and we'd like to talk to you about how we can help you on that journey towards receiving that recognition. So thank you again for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Bye.